The following population pyramids visually chart the progression of Hampshire's population since 1851 by age and sex. Key social and economic events occurring during the period and their impact on the population are highlighted along with the overall growth in the population. We start our story back in 1851 when the population of Hampshire stood at just over 230,000. That's over 1 million fewer people than there are in the county today. Whilst the first population census was taken in 1801, it was little more than a head count. It wasn't until 1851 that single year of age and sex were collected, allowing a population pyramid to be constructed. Hampshire's population pyramid at this time is triangular in shape, with higher percentages of the population in the younger age groups and many fewer in the older ages. This was a time when nationally the average number of children a woman would have was about 5, whilst life expectancy was just 40 years. 11% of those born would die before reaching their first birthday. Typically today it is less than 0.4%. Move on 30 years and by 1881 the population pyramid is still largely triangular. The larger bars for the young male age groups reflect Hampshire's military status at the time. The army first came to Aldershot in 1854 and the town soon became known as the home of the British Army and is still used by the army to the present day. Deaths nationally had started a decisive period of decline, and as such life expectancy had risen to around 46 years, though this varied widely, and particularly so, between urban and rural areas. One area of mortality that remained stubbornly high everywhere was infant mortality. During the last decade of the 19th century, 1 out of every 6 English babies born didn't survive to their first birthday. When we reach 1911, the population of Hampshire had risen to almost 390,000. This growth in the population is largely as a result of quite rapid declines in the numbers of deaths, coupled with relatively high numbers of births. As a result, the pyramid has now changed shape quite considerably from the very obvious triangular shape of the mid-19th century. Death rates amongst the very young have at last started to decline. However, the pyramid couldn't yet be described as rectangular, as there are still many more young people than older people. Jump forward 20 years, and by 1931 the population had gone through the First World War and a major flu pandemic, both of which had major impacts on the age and sex structure of the population. The military town slightly dulls the effects of both of these events for Hampshire, but lower numbers of men compared to women aged 30 to 49 is still evident. These events also had an impact on births, with fewer born during the war, followed by a short-lived boom at its end, but then fell away again during the Great Depression of the 1930s. The decline in births was followed by a decline in the infant mortality rate, though the numbers of babies not reaching their first birthday remained high relative to today's levels. All this results in a pyramid which is looking less and less like a triangle, though children still outnumber older people 2.5 to 1. There was no census in 1941 due to the Second World War, so we move forward to 1951, where Hampshire's population stood at just over 600,000 people. At this time, the pyramid is changing shape to become wider at the top, with increasing numbers of people surviving to the older ages. However, there is also a bulge in the 0 to 4 population. These are the post-Second World War baby boomers. We will see them, as well as the larger 1960s baby boomers, throughout the rest of our story, moving through the age groups. Life expectancy was higher than ever as a result of a range of policies which improved the environmental, medical, nutritional and social conditions of the population. At this time, survival differences between men and women at older ages become more visible on the pyramids. Prior to 1951, the proportions of the older population were largely similar for men and women. However, by 1951 there were over 10,000 more women aged 65 and over compared to men, and this trend can also be seen throughout the remaining pyramids. When we arrive at 1971, the population pyramid is continuing its move towards a more rectangular shape. Unfortunately, the 1971 data doesn't split out those aged 75 and over, and so the pyramid looks slightly distorted as they are all grouped into a single bar. During the 1960s, births nationally rocketed, peaking in 1964 in the mid-decade. Hampshire largely followed this national trend, and the 1960s baby boomers were born. High birth rates, coupled with declining death rates, meant this was the time of greatest growth across Hampshire. 10 years later, and Hampshire's population is now over 1 million for the first time. The pyramid continues to evolve. The 0 to 4 population has now shrunk back as a result of the low birth rates which followed the 1960s baby boom. This dip can largely be attributed to the take-up of the contraceptive pill following its introduction in the late 1960s. But it might also be explained by the introduction of the Equal Pay Act of 1970, which gave women the right to equal pay as men. Such a change would have increased the incentive for women to remain in the workplace. A secondary change started around this time was an increase in the age at which women were starting their families, a trend which continues to this day. Back in the 1970s and 80s, the average age for a woman at birth of her first child was about 24 years, whereas today the figure is closer to 28. The 1990s population of Hampshire is very different to that of 100 years ago, with the two largest bars being for those born following the two baby booms. The early 90s saw a slight rise in the number of births, largely as a result of the larger pool of women born during the 1960s baby boom entering childbearing ages. Also evident are the higher proportions of women amongst the elderly population. As we move into the 21st century, Hampshire's population becomes ever more stable with no large population fluctuations since the birth of the 1960s baby boomers. Generations after these have been smaller but more consistent, leading to an equalling out of the number of children and the elderly. Life expectancy is now 76 for men and 80 for women, whilst births have fallen to their lowest levels since the late 1970s. The infant mortality rate now suggests less than 1% of babies die during their first year. As we reach 2011, the impact on the population of events from early in the previous century are now diminishing, as many of those in the affected age groups have passed away. Events occurring later, such as the 1960s boom, are still clearly visible, now in their late 40s. The base of the pyramid is now widening again, as a result in part by the immigration of women of childbearing age. The opening up of European borders has meant that for the first time since policies to encourage migration into the UK following the end of the Second World War, immigration from overseas has had a real impact on the population. The population now stands at over 1.3 million and is the most rectangular in shape that it has ever been. In fact, in 2011, there were more people in Hampshire aged 65 and over than the total population of Hampshire in 1851. As for the population pyramid of 2021, what will that look like? With the real possibility of there being no census in 2021, how will the population even be calculated? Will Hampshire's population continue to age and grow? What events will happen over the next 10 years to affect the population? We don't have a crystal ball, but those that are already born will help create the population and age structure of Hampshire's future.